Hello, I'm Jill. I'm a former Jehovah's Witness. I've wanted to start this channel for a really long time now because although I'm aware of wonderful work going on in the ex-Jehovah's Witness community, I don't as often see this particular topic addressed, and where it is, it's usually part of a wider conversation. So I just really want to zoom in on something that I think most of us, if not all of us, have been affected by. And that's the subject of relationships and intimate relationships. I must start by saying I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not diagnosing or treating anybody. All I'm hoping to do is have a conversation and have my viewers hopefully find it relatable, and have any friends of mine that come on to speak or any interviewees find it cathartic to talk about their experiences. And if at the end of all that people feel heard, understood, and that maybe there is a positive way forward, then I've achieved everything that I want to achieve with this channel. So I have a bit of a list of things that I want to discuss. I'd love you to add to it if there's anything that's missing. I'd also love you to help me prioritise the list as well. Must say as well that this probably won't be family friendly sometimes. It probably won't always be suitable for children. So I will make that clear on the videos when that happens. So probably the most familiar and common intimate relationship within the Jehovah's Witness organisation is going to be marriage. It's going to be straightforward, heterosexual, man and woman marriage, because that is the standard issue within the organisation. It's a very traditional perspective that witnesses have. So there are quite a few things around that I'd like to talk about. One of those is the gender roles that are assigned. So there's very specific rules around headship, and the man being the head of the house and woman being submissive, and how maybe that doesn't work for everybody. So we need to talk about the assigned gender roles and how maybe it does work for some people, but where it doesn't, how that fits into that organisation, and how people feel when they're part of the organisation and don't feel that they fit into the scope of what they're being told to do. Also, I want to talk about how the organisation climbs into bed with people, with married couples, how it tells them what they can do, what they can't do, what they must do. And going back, there are some pretty surprising rules that have been made by the organisation and enforced with discipline as well, and how it climbs in between a married couple and tells them what they should be getting up to at this most intimate and private of moments. So those are a few of the things that I want to talk about around marriage. Linked to that, I would like to talk about what it must be like to be a long-term single witness. So maybe if somebody hasn't found a partner to marry by their 30s or 40s, culturally that's fairly late for witnesses, and around how the pool of people that you can choose from is very small. So you could only choose to be with other witnesses, otherwise you're committing something of a sin against the organisation. So that really narrows your pool. Also the culture of courtship, and how witnesses have to have a chaperone, and how courtship can actually be quite limited sometimes. And that's in part because of the restrictions around sexual activity. So there is to be no sexual activity whatsoever outside of a traditional marriage. And that includes lengthy intimacy. So there are even rules around hand holding, for example. So if somebody is single for a really long time, and they might be perfectly happy being single otherwise, they don't experience human contact and touch in the same way, and most of us need that. So I'd really like to talk with people who've been through that and how that felt, that they had a really small pool of people to choose from and may not have liked any of those, or may have just really liked being single. Perfectly understandable. But how it feels to be in that position, and maybe also being excluded from social events. I've heard that anecdotally repeated to me a number of times, that people feel that they are excluded because they're not part of a couple, and that's quite unusual in the Jehovah's Witness organisation. And another thing to talk about as well is what it's like when a marriage breaks down But if there hasn't been infidelity, partners can't move on within the organisation. So that may also be another reason. So we can just explore the whole thing. I got married at 21 and I got remarried again 10 years later, and I haven't really spent 5 minutes single. So I'd love to talk to people about how that feels and what they've experienced, because I can't speak from my own experience, but I'm really curious, and I think that it's a really important thing to discuss about the culture and about what people have been through. Tied to that as well are the prohibitions around sexual activity on one's own, solo sexual activity, which is also prohibited. So as well as that being something that's probably quite challenging for any adults who are single, as a teenager, one might try to do things that normal, healthy teenagers try to do. And if one is caught by one's parents doing that, they could have a huge intervention with the elders. I've actually seen it happen with people that were close to me, and they have to undergo this incredibly humiliating experience of having lots of people involved in something that's very private, very normal, very healthy. And the lasting effects of that can stretch for decades. So I'd like to talk about that as well. I also really want to discuss what it must be like to be an LGBTQ witness in the organisation. So the organisation has an awful lot to say on that subject. It's very disapproving of anybody outside of cis-het norms. So I really want to go into that and see what it must feel like to be somebody who has an identity that doesn't conform to the Jehovah's Witness organisation's preferred identity, and to be sat in the hall and have talks or literature where the organisation makes it very clear what it thinks of you and your identity. And it also makes very clear to your friends and family what they need to think of you and your identity. And chances are, if you're sat in the hall, you probably haven't come out. So you're taking all of this in and listening to it and probably feeling enormous amounts of shame, which is awful. But also, because you're taught that God knows all and sees all, you may not have come out to your human friends and family, but you would be believing that God knows that about you. And God sent these lessons to say that that part of you is bad. And how it just must feel to think that this being that you're supposed to be drawing close to, who has power of life and death over you ultimately, feels about you as a person. So I'd really like to get people with lived experience in to talk about that as a broader scope. So we've seen wonderful testimonials, motivating, heartfelt, inspiring testimonials from people who have experienced that in their lives. I'd love to hear what it's like in a broader sense. I know that we have some transsexual ex-JWs, bisexual, some lesbian, gay, and all kinds of different identities that I'm not going to go into here. But anything that doesn't conform to witness norms is disapproved of. So across the board, there may be some similarities in how people feel, and I'd really love to dive into that, and maybe we can help somebody who's watching these videos and is in that position of sitting in the hall week after week and hearing this about themselves, and maybe we can help them see that there's a way out and there's light at the end of the tunnel. That would be wonderful. Another serious topic to dive into is what happens when there's maybe a crime or an assault, and how the organisation has made us feel that we should respond to these things. So maybe it's a domestic violence issue within a relationship, marriage, or maybe parent and child domestic violence. Maybe there's been an assault, a sexual assault between a Jehovah's Witness as the perpetrator and a Jehovah's Witness as the victim. We often talk about this in the context of what happens when children are involved, but I haven't heard so much discussed when it's adults involved. So I'd really like to go into that. I can talk from my own experience and maybe get some others in to share their experience, go into what the literature has to say about it, and even I think going back as far as the Bible storybook, which is something that most witnesses are read from the cradle, their very first stories maybe, there is a particular chapter I can think of that is just taught victim blaming from babyhood. So I'd really like to go into that. Also, if anybody is watching this and has ever been part of a married couple in Bethel, I am so curious. I'd really like to know how that went. So you're in this compound, kind of permanent hotel situation. For anybody who doesn't know, Bethel is the kind of cult compound for Jehovah's Witnesses. So there's usually one on at least every continent and major country, major in size, that is, size of country, and that's where the workers live. So they're pretty self-contained. They've got their own food produce quite often, and there's all kinds of employment on the compound. So people all live together and they're all Jehovah's Witnesses. So when your cleaner comes in, do you have to hide your toys? And when you're having an argument, how does it feel to know that the behind the walls there are people in your congregation? And then also when you're, as a married couple, trying to do things that normal married couples do, then how do you deal with people next door hearing that kind of thing? So I'd really love to know what it's like to be a married couple living on top of hundreds and hundreds of other married couples and how that works. So another thing that I want to talk about is judicial hearings. Again, for anybody who doesn't know, judicial hearings are when any Jehovah's Witness breaks one of the multitude of rules, usually the more serious rules. So a judicial hearing can be called for smoking, or drinking to excess, or maybe monetary fraud, quite a few things. There's a big long list of things in the Shepherd the Flock of God book, which is available online, not by jw.org, but there are quite a few places on the internet that have copies that have been scanned. But one of the most common, probably the most common reason for a judicial committee being formed is sexual activity. And if it's a situation like mine was, I was 17 years old, I had committed the heinous crime of having sex with my then fiance, and I was hauled in front of a panel of 3 middle-aged to older men, and I was asked incredibly intimate and personal and private details about what had happened to ascertain repentance. Now, in those cases, they are looking to see whether you are repentant. They're looking to see how planned the incident was. So they may ask you really detailed questions about contraception, or even I was asked about what lingerie I was wearing. So you can see how this is completely open to abuse. And the consequences of not crying enough, or not appearing sorry enough, or maybe having just pissed off one of your panel at some point in the past, is that you may lose your family. You may lose everything you have through the disfellowshipping arrangement. So one of the outcomes of a judicial hearing can be that you're disfellowshipped. And when that happens, there's an edict from the platform that you are no longer a Jehovah's Witness, which is a massive dog whistle for everybody in the hall to know they are not to speak to you anymore. If they see you coming down the street, they'll probably cross the road rather than make eye contact with you. And that includes your own mother, brothers and sisters, best friend, everybody. Now that can be really serious as well. I mean, that's serious enough, but it can also have an impact on maybe your job, because witnesses don't tend to go to university. They're advised not to go to university. A lot of them can be entrepreneurs. So you often find in the culture of Jehovah's Witnesses that there will be 1 or 2 brothers usually in the hall who have businesses, and they may employ other witnesses in the congregation. And so if you become disfellowshipped and you're in that situation, you may lose your job. Also, some of those may be landlords, because again, they're reasonably well off as entrepreneurs and then tend to buy property and rent it to witnesses, just speaking from experience and what I've seen. So there is a situation where you could lose all your friends and family, your job, and your home by being disfellowshipped. So judicial hearings are absolutely holding a sword over your head. Another thing that I want to talk about, which could be quite fun, is what happens when we leave the organisation, when we realise that we can discover who we are, what we like, particularly in a sexual context. Maybe we find that we have an interest in kinks, fetishes, and communities, and what that kid in a sweet shop feeling is like, to realise that there's no judgment, there are no longer many consequences, certainly no social consequences to exploring yourself, and how we can do that safely while having fun. So there are quite a few XJW communities where people explore those kind of issues, and I'd love to talk to maybe some of my friends and others about how they learnt about themselves after leaving. Also, on a more serious note, when we leave the organisation, we may be left with some residual damage. So, for instance, the courtship process is so unlike what's out there in the world. Do we think that a couple of cinema dates equals an engagement? Or the reverse of that? Do we struggle to commit? Maybe I know some women are triggered to a degree by men in suits. I know that sounds bizarre to anybody who hasn't been part of the community, but because witness men, always wear suits, unless they're doing some kind of DIY or hall construction or something. They wear suits for field ministry, and they wear suits at the hall. And if you've had a really terrible experience, you may even find that difficult, or maybe just be so sick of submission that you'd never want to be with somebody in that situation again. So those things can be something that's hard to work through. Obviously, I can't speak for our XJW men, so I would really like to hear from them as well, the impact that being a witness had on them and relationships, and how they can move forward. Some people become quite hung up on what they call body count. So for a witness, nothing more than a body count of 0 people you've slept with is okay. Obviously, in broader thinking communities in the wider world, we find that these things don't matter. But it can be quite difficult to shake that off, and all kinds of other experiences that I'm sure my viewers and my friends can bring to the discussion. Another thing that I'd like to talk about is some of the big decisions that people made. So, for instance, I chose not to go to university because as a witness I believed Armageddon, so the death of anybody who's not a witness, was right around the corner any day now. I felt that we had to drag people out of these burning buildings that were their lives. I felt that if the people that I called on the ministry with their little toddlers behind their legs, they were going to die any minute, and it was on me to save them. So there was no other option but regular pioneering. Also, I love learning. I love studying. I would have loved to go to university, but one thing that softened the blow of not doing that was thinking that after Armageddon, when I've saved everybody I can save, we're going to live forever. Witnesses believe that they are going to move into, after the great day of Armageddon, they're going to move into this paradise world where they can start rebuilding this utopia. So you have a beautiful home that you've built yourself, and you will live forever around about the age of 30, physical age of 30, seriously, for all eternity on Earth. So billions and billions of years, you will see so many changes. You'll see mountains formed before your eyes, but you will still be living on Earth aged 30. So in that world, I could study anything. I would have the physical health, the mental acuity to be able to study absolutely every topic on the planet, every type of grass, every type of moss, the tops of mountains, the bottoms of the oceans. I would be able to explore every inch of this planet. So not going to university at that time was a small price to pay, to be able to study for the rest of all eternity. But other big decisions that people forewent were, for instance, having children. So if you believe that this paradise earth is coming up, you believe there's no war, there's no crime, there's no sickness, then that would be a really good time to have a child. And this world, with all of those issues that exist, possibly isn't a very good time to have a child. If you believe that that's the reality, then it makes sense to hold back on having a family until you're in that situation. But, spoiler alert, Armageddon hasn't come, and the paradise hasn't come. So what must it be like to reach maybe your 50s, maybe later, and without the forward planning required, not be able to have a family now? Maybe leaving the organisation and realising that you completely missed that opportunity. Obviously, it's completely fine if people don't want to have children at all. That's a completely different issue and not what I'm talking about here. But I've known people who sincerely wanted a family, who would have made wonderful parents, and who put it off because they thought that this paradise was coming where they'd have a beautiful home, no worries about food or money or sickness or crime or their child being hurt. And now they've realised that it's not happening. So then another issue, I think this is probably about the last one, is about loss. So maybe going through a divorce as a Jehovah's Witness, maybe you've left the organisation and your partner, your spouse has stayed in, and what that's like, the child custody issues that surround it. Maybe some people have managed to make it work. Some people leave the organisation and somehow they've been able to keep their marriage with their spouse who's in. And so I'd really like to talk about how hard that must be and how they've managed it. Others, unfortunately, the relationship breaks down because the ideological chasm is just too great. So to talk about that and maybe talk about how they've been able to move on or what their experience has been. It's not compulsory to be okay now. I'm not expecting that from people. So let's just talk about what happened to you and how you feel about it. Connected to loss is also mortality and bereavement. So I already just mentioned that witnesses believe they're going to spend all eternity aged physically 30. So when we get to our 40s, like me, and we look in the mirror and we see wrinkles and we see grey hairs and we see that our metabolism isn't doing what it used to do, then that's actually quite offensive. I'm quite insulted that I've actually topped 30 and these things are happening. And jokes aside and vanity aside, we have to face our own mortality, which we've never had to do. I realise I'm going to die. I know that sounds really miserable and deep, sorry about that, but it's a real thing that we have to come to terms with. It's pretty serious because we've never considered it. And even if we did die in this system, we believed we were going to pop up like a daisy any day now in the new paradise system and live forever. So even if you did die when you're a believer, kind of doesn't matter because all you're going to do is pop up soon anyway. And you think that Armageddon's around the corner any day now. Literally, witnesses think the skies are going to blacken and Armageddon is going to come any second. They would not be surprised to see it happen right this minute looking out the window. And then you're going to reverse age to 30. So mortality is a really big thing to get your head around when you leave the organisation, and it can be really difficult. And obviously people go different ways. So some become other kinds of Christian, some become atheists, some join other maybe ideological or faith groups. So how do we deal with that? And then finally linked to that is bereavement. So you'll find sometimes that witnesses, they will be bereaved of somebody that they were close to and that they loved, and they will say things like when they pass away, oh well, we'll see them again soon. I've heard that a huge number of times from witnesses. I have a hope, we'll see them again soon. The whole funeral is around that because it's pretty much a recruitment exercise for bereaved family and friends. So they don't, in my view, grieve in a normal way. And I'm not sure it's terribly healthy. And definitely when you leave the organisation and you realise that you haven't processed the deaths of these people that you loved and that they're just gone now, that can be really difficult. I lost 2 grandparents before I was fully awake and was hit by having to grieve for them. And more recently, I've lost my grandmother just at the very end of 2020. And processing that has been a completely different situation. I've actually given way to the tears properly. I'm actually welling up a little bit thinking about it. But I felt hit by all of those losses all at once. So I can't imagine how it must feel to somebody who's lost maybe somebody even closer, a child or a spouse or a parent, and how they suddenly have to process that. So some fun topics, some serious topics. These are the things that I could think of. I do have a few others as well. What it's like being in a divided household as a witness, which is where one partner's in and one partner is worldly, so never in. Also the mental health impact on being a witness. So I think some of the things in the Shepherd book to do with disfellowshipping are actually symptomatic of mental ill health. But I'm going to need somebody with more expertise than me to come on and talk about that. So for instance, just one example that I talk about fairly often, if you look up the definition of gluttony in the Shepherd book, I think that's a perfect description of either binge eating disorder or an eating disorder like bulimia. So I think it'd be really interesting to talk about how people are essentially having trauma inflict mental ill health on them, and then the consequences so the symptoms of that then end up getting them disfellowshipped and re-traumatized. So, but I'm going to need some kind of expert to talk to about that one. So anything else that you'd like me to discuss, please put it in the comments below. I'm going to try and, if I can be clever, put some kind of voting mechanism in place so that people can vote. And I'll just really quickly introduce myself because this is an intro video, and I'll probably do the long and boring story at some other point when I'm generally more comfortable with seeing myself on camera. So I live in the UK, born up near the Scottish borders. We moved to South Africa, we moved to the northeast of the country, Southampton, and now I live in Sussex. Most of that moving around was following my dad, who was never a witness, and he worked in oil, so we tended to follow his job around. My mum became a witness when I was a toddler, and she became baptised when I think I was about 3 years old. I got baptised when I was 13. I thought I really wanted to. I thought I was making that decision for myself. As we all know, as adults, 13-year-olds aren't brilliant at making lifelong, serious decisions. Anyway, I started regular pioneering around 16 for the reasons that I've already explained. Was married at 21 to a witness, whole other story, but my kids may see these videos one day, so I'll have to be diplomatic in what I say. I think my ex-husband and I both agree it wasn't a terribly good idea. But one of the wonderful things that happened in my life was having my 3 children. I've got a son who is currently 17. I've got twin daughters who are 15. They're the absolute light of my life. About 10 years into my marriage, I was desperately unhappy. So unhappy that I had this tattoo done. Don't know if you can see it. Anyway. It's a bird flying away. It's really rubbish. I'd like to get a better one. I had that done because I was really unhappy and I wanted to divorce. But because I was a witness, that's just not straightforward. 6 months after having that done, I met Richard, and we had a 2-week-long affair before the keyboard logger on my laptop caught me out and all hell broke loose. And Richard and I left together. We were disfellowshipped. We got married a couple of years later. We were reinstated just before the Twickenham Convention, International Convention in 2016. I don't know, something like that. So just before that, we were reinstated. And then we knew something was really fishy about the organisation, but we didn't quite know where to place our feelings about it. I went to visit my friend who was disassociated a couple of years later, and I felt like a terrible person because she's wonderful. She's absolutely wonderful, just one of the most beautiful human beings you could ever meet. And I parked behind a van so nobody would see my car, and I scurried over the road with my hood over me to go and see her, and she told me about the United Nations membership that the organisation had had. So if you don't know about that, look it up. There's nothing wrong with being NGOs of the UN, but there is when you've spent decades telling people that the UN is the wild beast of Revelation, Satan's own pet, and it's about to turn on Jehovah's Witnesses. So it was the hypocrisy rather than the act for me. So after that, the scales just fell. I went down the rabbit hole, finding all kinds of lies that we'd been told about the failed prophecies and about Mexico and Malawi and about the child abuse mishandling, all of these things. I just probably had a couple of years of maybe being a little bit obsessed with it because I'd been such a true believer. I was really hurt, to be honest, to find out that I'd been lied to all along, and consciously lied to. In some cases, conscious cover-ups. Literature changed between the publication of the magazine and the publication of the bound volume, and somebody had to have gone and done that. Or quote mining, where the ellipses between the quotes make the quote mean the opposite of what's been put in the literature. And somebody knew that, and they went ahead and did it anyway. So now finally, I think I've come out the other side. I'm not particularly angry, apart from the things that a normal person should be angry about, like the child abuse mishandling. Furious. Angry apostate there, because we should be. But for me, myself, I'm at peace with the situation. I just want to help other people. And I've noticed this gap in what we talk about. And I'd just really like to fill it, because I think that I see people crying out to discuss this topic, but I don't see any kind of larger platform in which we discuss it together as a group. So that's what I'm looking for out of this. It's been lovely to talk to you all and to spill all of these thoughts that I've had for so long, and hopefully speak to you again soon.